In the sweltering August of 1845, Eloise Devereaux, the formidable mistress of Blackwood Manor in Alabama, issued a decree that defied not only law and decency, but nature itself. She commanded her only son, Alistair, a boy of 19, born with skin like milk and eyes the color of faded rubies, to begin systematically breeding with a chosen group of her enslaved women. This wasn't for profit. It wasn't for punishment. It was an experiment born from a twisted obsession with blood purity. The local gentry whispered of her madness, but they could not fathom the true, horrifying purpose behind her command. By the following spring, Blackwood Manor had become a silent prison of biological terror. 7 infants were born, a strange sickness began to plague the Devereaux bloodline, and the ground itself seemed to reject the family's dead. Why would a mother inflict such a monstrous fate on her own son? What was the unspeakable goal of her genetic experiment? And what became of the children born from this union of cruelty and despair? Before we descend into the shadows of Blackwood Manor, support our channel by subscribing, hitting that bell, and letting us know in the comments what you think of this horrifying premise. Now, allow me to take you to that cursed Alabama estate, where the magnolias bloomed heavy and sweet, masking the scent of rot that was already seeping from the foundations. Eloise Devereaux was a woman sculpted from pride and granite. Her family had clawed its way to prominence, and she viewed their bloodline as a fragile masterpiece to be curated and perfected. The birth of her son, Alistair, was her life's most profound humiliation. He was an albino, a spectral presence in a world that valued hardy, sun-toughened men. To Eloise, his porcelain flesh and light-sensitive eyes were not a quirk of nature, but a stain, a testament to some hidden weakness in their sacred lineage. She raised him in isolation, a ghost haunting the grand halls of Blackwood Manor, tutored in darkness and shielded from the judging eyes of the Alabama sun. While other boys learned to ride and hunt, Alistair learned to be invisible. But his mother's obsession was not simple shame. It was a puzzle she intended to solve. She devoured forbidden texts on eugenics and animal husbandry, her mind twisting these nascent sciences into a dark theology of her own making. She convinced herself that Alistair's condition was not a curse, but a blank canvas. She believed his pure but flawed blood, when mixed with what she deemed the hardiest and most resilient stock on her plantation, could produce a new kind of heir, an heir with Alistair's pale flaw burned away, leaving only a stronger, purer Devereaux. It was a theory steeped in arrogance and abject cruelty. Her plan began to take shape not as a thought, but as a conviction. She would use the bodies of the enslaved as the crucible, and her own son as the catalyst, to forge the perfect heir she felt God had denied her. In late summer, she made her selection. 5 young women, chosen for their strength, their health, their perceived vitality. They were brought from the fields to the main house, their confusion quickly turning to ice-cold terror as the mistress of Blackwood Manor explained their new, horrifying duty. The breeding began in the west wing of the manor, in a series of rooms that Eloise had stripped bare. The finery was replaced with cold, functional furniture, transforming a place of southern comfort into a sterile laboratory of human suffering. For Alistair, it was a descent into a nightmare from which he could not wake. Raised in isolation, taught to be ashamed of his own body, he was now being forced into the most intimate of acts as a tool for his mother's grotesque ambition. He resisted, his quiet nature erupting into pleas and arguments. But Eloise was immovable. Her will was absolute. Any hesitation on his part was met with punishments of unimaginable cruelty. Days spent locked in the sun-drenched smokehouse, his sensitive skin blistering, or weeks of near starvation until his compliance was guaranteed. He became a hollowed-out puppet, his spirit eroding with each forced encounter. For the enslaved women, the ordeal was a different dimension of hell. They were already chattel, their bodies not their own, but this was a violation that transcended the brutal norms of their existence. It was a cold, calculated, and perpetual assault, orchestrated by a woman who saw them not as people, but as vessels. Their names were erased, replaced by numbers in Eloise's meticulous ledger where she tracked cycles, dates, and outcomes with the dispassionate precision of a scientist. The matriarch of the enslaved community, an old woman named Hettie who served in the house, watched with eyes that held generations of sorrow. She saw the light in the young women's eyes flicker and die. She saw the way Alistair would flinch from his own shadow. The air in Blackwood Manor grew thick with unspoken anguish, a suffocating silence punctuated only by the scratching of Eloise's pen in her journal and the soft, desperate weeping that bled through the floorboards at night. The grand experiment was underway, and every soul trapped within its gears was slowly, methodically being ground into dust. The spring of 1846 arrived not with renewal, but with a series of horrifying revelations. The first of the children were born, and Eloise Devereaux's dream of a purified bloodline shattered into a million nightmarish pieces. The infants were not the perfect heirs she had envisioned. Instead, They were marked by a host of afflictions the plantation doctor had never witnessed. Some were born with Alistair's albinism, but it was compounded by brittle bones that snapped with the slightest touch. Others had skin covered in weeping sores or eyes that were clouded and blind from birth. One child was born with a heart so weak its cries were mere whispers before it fell silent forever. The genetic ghost Eloise had tried to exorcise had not been banished. It had returned with reinforcements, twisting and mutating into something far more monstrous. The so-called curse was real, but it wasn't a supernatural hex. It was the devastating result of a recessive gene, amplified and made manifest by her horrific experiment. Eloise's obsession curdled into a venomous fury. She refused to accept the scientific reality, instead seeing the afflicted children as a personal betrayal, an act of sabotage by the enslaved women or even by Alistair himself. She locked the mothers and their ailing infants away in the damp, squalid infirmary, treating them as failed products to be discarded. Her paranoia became a living thing, stalking the halls of Blackwood Manor. She accused the plantation staff of poisoning her food, of casting spells on the children. Her ledger, once filled with neat, scientific observations, now devolved into frantic, hateful scrawls, blaming everyone but herself for the abomination she had created. The other plantation owners, once content to whisper about her eccentricity, now began to speak of a genuine, dangerous madness that had taken root at Blackwood. The estate was becoming an island, isolated by its own horror, and Eloise Devereaux was its deranged queen, reigning over an empire of her own making, built entirely on pain. As the mistress of the manor descended into madness, a quiet and desperate rebellion began to bloom in the shadows. The architect of this resistance was Hettie, the elderly house servant whose quiet demeanor concealed a fierce intelligence and a profound knowledge of the land. She had watched Eloise's cruelty for years, but this latest atrocity was a line from which there was no return. She began using her knowledge of herbs and roots, not to heal, but to fight back in the only way she could. She started by brewing a tea from a specific, bitter root, a concoction that, when consumed regularly, induced a temporary but effective sterility in women. She disguised its taste with mint and licorice, and began secretly giving it to the other enslaved women who had been selected for Eloise's next round of breeding. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. Simultaneously, a profound change was occurring in Alistair. The birth of the afflicted children had broken the last vestiges of his submission. The sight of their suffering, and the cold indifference of his mother, finally ignited a spark of defiance in his hollowed-out soul. He began to see the enslaved women not as instruments of his shame, but as fellow prisoners in his mother's asylum. He started committing small acts of sabotage. He would mislabel his mother's notes, swap out samples she was studying, and, most importantly, he began sneaking food and clean water to the women and children locked in the infirmary. It was during one of these clandestine visits that Hettie intercepted him. She saw not a master, but a broken boy. In a hushed, urgent whisper, she revealed her plan, not just to stop the breeding, but to bring down the entire house of Devereaux. She had discovered Eloise's ledger, the meticulous record of her crimes. Hettie couldn't read, but Alistair could. He now held the key to his mother's damnation, and Hettie held the will to see it through. A fragile, unthinkable alliance was forged in the darkness, between the master's son and the enslaved matriarch, united by a singular goal, to ensure that the horrors of Blackwood Manor would finally be brought to an end. The climax arrived on a suffocatingly humid night in late September. Eloise, in a fit of paranoid rage, had declared she would cleanse the infirmary by selling off the sickly mothers and their cursed children to a notoriously brutal trader from Mississippi. For Hettie and Alistair, the time for subtlety was over. As Eloise slept, fortified by a laudanum-laced nightcap that Hettie had prepared, Alistair stole the ledger from his mother's study. He met Hettie by the old well, where she and a handful of the most trusted field hands were gathered. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would not just escape, they would erase the place from the earth. Using lantern oil from the stores, they methodically doused the foundations of the main house, the cotton gin, and the infirmary, ensuring the mothers and children were evacuated first into the darkness of the surrounding woods. Alistair was the one who struck the match. The flames caught instantly, climbing the dry timber of Blackwood Manor with an unholy hunger. The fire was the final, desperate scream of all the souls who had suffered there. As the inferno lit up the night sky, Alistair, holding the ledger, led the small group of survivors away from the plantation, toward a network of sympathizers Hettie had known of for years. Eloise Devereaux never woke up. She was consumed by the fire she had metaphorically started, her body buried under the collapsing weight of her own ambition. When authorities arrived, they found only smoldering ruins and whispers of a slave revolt. The story of the breeding experiment was either dismissed as fanciful rumor or deliberately buried, but the ledger survived. Alistair carried it with him, a testament to the crimes committed, a burden he would bear for the rest of his life. The unspeakable genetic curse of Blackwood Manor ended that night, not with a cure, but with fire and emancipation. It served as a horrifying reminder that the deadliest diseases are not those of the blood, but those of the soul, obsessions that, if left unchecked, will burn everything and everyone to the ground. The true curse of Blackwood Manor wasn't genetic. It was the belief that one human being has the right to treat another as a mere object for their own ambition. That is a poison that has plagued history for centuries. What do you think became of Alistair and the survivors? Do you believe stories like this are purely historical? Or do they hold a warning for us today? Leave your comment below. If you found this journey into the dark corners of history compelling, subscribe to Forgotten AMC. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale from the archives of the abandoned and the damned. Share this video, because these are the stories that must never be allowed to fade. These stories are carved into the very soul of the land. We are here to listen. See you in the next shadow.